Okay, so this is the last of the issues and debates videos for paper 3, which is coming up tomorrow, so Monday afternoon. So we're just going to sort of go through looking at reductionism, holism, and socially sensitive research. Going through. So reductionism and holism. So it's a debate stating whether holism or reductionism is a better approach to understanding human behaviour. So it can be a little bit sometimes confused between free will and determinism. So reductionism is quite similar to determinism because it's looking at sort of reducing humans down to their smallest parts. So just be aware of that. So holism, or the holistic approach, is about studying the whole, whereas reductionism is that behaviour is better to be understood by breaking it down into its constituent parts. So holistic comes from Gestalt psychology, who says that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and looking at separate parts doesn't help to understand the person. Whereas a reductionist approach is based on scientific principle of parsimony. All behaviour should be explained by simple principles. So the levels of explanation in psychology is definitely worth knowing for a 16 marker or an 8 marker. It comes down and it breaks it down into these different levels, from a higher level, sort of like a broader level. So think of it like that, coming right down to the specific individual neurochemical area level. So the social cultural level, OCD impacts on relationships and work, friendships, etc. And then psychological level, so looking at the individual's experiences of anxiety. A physical level, so movements, repetitive movements such as hand washing. Environmental, so their learning experiences. Physiological, which is the abnormal functioning in the brain, so those changes in the brain, and then down to the neurochemical level, so the underproduction of serotonin. And each level, as I've mentioned, is more reductionist than before. So it's definitely worth looking at that, SPNPE, doing some sort of acronym or poem, just to sort of remember that, okay, remember that order. So before I go on to the evaluation of this, I'll just talk you through holism, reductionism in terms of the approaches. So the only approach that takes it from a holistic point of view is the humanistic approach. All the others are reductionist, but in different ways. So biological is reductionist in terms of reducing humans down to the neurotransmitters and the chemicals. Behaviorist is reductionist down to our reaction with the environment. Cognitive is input, throughput, and output. So you could compare them and say that they're all reductionist, but they're all for different reasons, okay? And then that brings us on to the AO3. So a limitation of holism is that it lacks practical value. Because of the fact holism is a wide explanation, it's difficult to understand the cause of behaviour. So therefore it's i.e. depression. So it's difficult to treat the depression because obviously there's a wide range of explanations there, so you can't narrow it down and go, oh, it's the neurotransmitters or it's the upbringing, because if you're looking at a holistic approach, then you don't know how to sort of summarise that. But a strength of reductionism is that it forms the basis of scientific explanation. So this is by operationalizing the variable, observing predetermined categories, and it allows psychology to place on the same pedestal as other natural sciences. So this simplifies a complex phenomenon and reduces validity. So that's a bit of a sort of a discussion area you can have between holism and reductionism there. Another limitation of reductionism is that some behaviours can be understood at a higher level. So, for example, in the Stanford prison experiment, this has to be understood at the socio-cultural level due to the interaction of the people and the groups. Conformity can only really be explained at this social level, as there's no conformity gene, you can't bring it down to that more simplistic level. Cognitive neuroscience would say that thoughts are the result of what occurs in the brain through physical processes and changes, but neuroscientists struggle to explain the differences in the brain when we are thinking about different aspects, for example, like a colour, or different colours, but the same area of the brain is being used. So this is known as the explanatory gap, and may suggest that thinking is one stage of what's happening in the brain. So if we think about colours, when they do brain scans, they look at people obviously using their brain, and it's exactly the same area of the brain, but we know that they're thinking about red, orange, different colours. And so that's how do we break that down into sort of a reductionist perspective. Okay, so this last bit is looking at the idiographic and nomothetic debate. So idiographic and nomothetic is, again, quite similar. Well, not similar, but it's these sort of key terms where one's broad and one's looking at sort of key factors. So idiographic involves looking at individuals in more detail and gaining a better understanding of them. It uses mainly qualitative research, so the humanistic and the psychodynamic are the strongest examples because they both use case studies. I always think of the idiographic like individuals, and nomothetic is numbers. And the examples from the humanistic and psychodynamic is unconditional positive regard and little hands. And then for the nomothetic, you're looking at larger groups of people to make generalizations about behavior and treatments for those people. So it mainly uses quantitative research. The behaviorist and the biological are strongest examples. And then you've got Skinner and also Sperry for split brain research there. So a strength of the idiographic approach, it contributes to the nomothetic approach. So you can use the two to work together. So for example, studying one person in depth allows further research to then be carried out on a wider group of individuals. So for example, HM was studied in a lot of depth in memory, and this led to further research on short-term memory and long-term memory, and also the working memory model. But case studies and idiographic methods are still limited as they are studying unique individuals, and these are the least scientific of the approaches. And there's an argument to say that both methods are fitting within the aims of science. The nomothetic is through objectivity and standardization, whereas the idiographic through triangulation, where a range of methods are combined to increase validity. So they might do interviews, questionnaires, observations, all those things, similar to how they did with HM to sort of pull it all together. So another limitation of the nomothetic is a loss of understanding of the individual. Because the nomothetic approach is preoccupied with general laws, prediction and control, they lose this whole person focus. So it's important to recognise these two ideas as opposing. So for example, Schaeffer's attachment styles would be considered nomothetic because they give those stages of attachment and development and then apply it to a range of children, or all children. Whereas case studies of extreme neglect are idiographic because obviously every case is different. We can use these types of research to complement each other and ensure children who experience neglect are supported through other research and findings to bring out successful outcomes for them. And then the last section that I'm going to be looking at is ethical implications of research, studies and theory. So just in terms of what's come up before, nomothetic idiographic came up as a 4 marker in 2022. It came up as an 8 marker in 2021. And so more recently, socially sensitive research came up last year as an 8 marker and a 2 marker in 2019. Potentially could come up again. Reductionism, holism came up last as a 16 marker, but in 2020. So that obviously 2020 and 2021 were both teacher assessed grades, so not full range of students sat those papers. And obviously last year it was reduced content. So it's worth just sort of considering. The one that hasn't come up is free will determinism as a long essay that came up as just a quick one on soft determinism last year. So obviously it's really, really difficult to predict, but just sort of being aware really of what's come up before and just sort of focusing. But just really look at sort of key terms as well in your textbook, sort of just key areas sometimes in different sections of your textbook. There's terminology, like that levels of explanation. It's worth really just sort of learning and going over for 16 markers. So the final section is ethical implications of research, studies and theory. So this develops the idea in year 1 on ethical guidelines and ethical issues. So it gains an understanding of the implications of research. So when you've conducted research, what those implications can have within society. So this refers to the consequences that psychological research may have. Although it covers all areas, some areas of psychology have more social sensitivity than others. So studies on depression may have bigger consequences on people in society than studies on memory, for example. So there are implications for the research process. So all areas of planning need to consider the social sensitivity of research. So Sieber and Stanley warn the way in which research questions are phrased can affect the way findings are investigated. For example, research into heterosexual bias, where homosexual relationships are compared against heterosexual norms. So you're dealing with participants considering issues such as informed consent, confidentiality, and psychological harm may be important in socially sensitive research. For example, research on the dependent variable needs to ensure, research on domestic violence needs to ensure confidentiality and protection for the participants. So that's an important change there. So, a limitation though is that researchers also need to think about how their findings are used. Sometimes the findings may impact on certain groups and lead to prejudice which are backed up by science or sometimes a pseudoscience. So, for example, in the textbook, Bert's research on the development of children's learning at age 11 led to the introduction of grammar schools and comprehensive schools, which was basically separating children in terms of their intelligence on an exam that was sat at age 11. So if you think back to how you would have performed at age 11, and then you would essentially have either gone into a grammar school which was focusing on exams and I was thinking of it like sort of more seated education, like the traditional education, whereas a comprehensive was more sort of working sort of at an easier level, and so they were separating children at age 11, which is now considered very young. So a strength of socially sensitive research can have benefits for the group that have been studied. So for example, in 1952, the first DSM lists homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disorder. And then research from the Kinsey report, it was found that by interviewing 5,000 men and 6,000 women, they were able to support the idea that homosexuality was a normal variant of human sexual behaviour, and homosexuality was then finally removed from the DSM in 1973, still 20 years later. So socially sensitive research can still have downsides, such as the finding of the criminal gene. Does this mean that people should be removed of responsibility if they show they have this gene? I mean, I think that's quite a strong statement there to say it's downsides. I think it's still really important to show that there is the criminal gene. And then obviously if it's in your family, which there is people that have found that it's in their family, but they're not criminals, but they've noticed that perhaps they have a shorter threshold for anger or impulsivity, and so therefore if you know that it's in your family, then you can protect yourself and make sure that you get involved in high adrenaline activities rather than criminal behaviour. So policymakers rely on research, and it's really important that socially sensitive research carries on because it helps develop policy in areas such as mental health, childcare, social work and crime, etc. But another issue is that when research is socially sensitive, it can lead to researchers avoiding doing it. They just prefer not to sort of get involved really and choose a safer area. So Sieber and Stanley state that this is not a responsible approach, and it is important for researchers to be reflexive in their approach. They reflect on how personal beliefs affect the research process. So as long as when you carry out socially sensitive research, the researchers are reflexive, that's a nice keyword to take with you into the exam. That pops up quite a lot in the textbook. Again, it's very current, and it's being reflective on the findings and the research and taking information from it and moving forward. Okay, so that is the last one of my paper 3 videos. Obviously, yeah, please like and subscribe, and I'll keep putting up learning videos, revision videos. Tell your friends, tell your family to look at these, and also pop questions below. But yeah, just really go over those sort of key areas. There could be as well in terms of essays. Last year there was 2 16 markers. In 2021 there was 2 16 markers. In 2020 there was 2 16 markers. In 2019 there was 3 16 markers. and 2018 2 16 markers. So I would say there's going to be probably at least 2 16 markers, and then you can have 8, obviously 2 8 markers. Just obviously be aware that you can still get research methods in here as well. So features of a science, I've mentioned this before, but theory and hypothesis testing, paradigm and a paradigm shift, look that up. Objectivity and the empirical method, types of validity and how to assess it, types of reliability, how to assess it, levels of measurement, just know that that means nominal, ordinal, or interval. And then what is an example of a parametric test? So that is the ones at the bottom bit of the table are parametric, so related t-test, unrelated t, and Pearson's R. And these are, when possible, if there's a choice, sometimes there is a choice, these are preferred. Okay. So yeah, so I've got some summaries of all of the topics for schizophrenia, forensic, and gender. I'll go through that with my students tomorrow. But yeah, good luck. Bye.